Okay, we're continuing to talk about the bracha for foods that have changed, not the way they were originally. Last time we spoke about the different shitas, first in Rishonim, about whether foods that are crushed or pureed keep their bracha or not. And then we continued on with a riff about if something is created for a specific purpose. If it's usually eaten in a certain way, then that might help it hold on to its bracha. And then we continued on with the Chasam Sofer about when we want to decide how a food is used, we have to look at the overall picture of how it's used and not specific look at how humans necessarily eat that food. Okay, so now we're going to continue on to some other foods. And first we're going to do tomato paste and peanut butter. So the Chasam Sofer we had used, who was explaining, he actually was talking about was corn products. But it's not going to help us when we try to understand what the bracha should be for tomato paste or things like that and peanut butter. Let's start with tomatoes. Most people who think that tomatoes are tomatoes, all tomatoes are the same. But it's not exactly true. Companies that want to make tomato paste or tomato sauce and those kind of things have used very specific breeds of tomato which are best for those uses. Okay, and they're not desirable to use as is, like to make a salad out of them. For example, there's a tomato called a Roma tomato, which are very fleshy, whatever that means, and they're really good if you're pureeing into tomato paste, and it's not the kind of tomato you're usually going to see when you walk into the fruit store. Okay, so you can therefore assume that if you have tomato paste or ketchup or tomato sauce, they're making that from a tomato that's made specifically to grow for that reason. Okay, that's what these tomatoes. All tomatoes are not created equal, and these tomatoes are tomatoes that are meant, for pureeing and turning into sauces and things like that. Okay, if so, based on the rules that we saw last time and that we've heard about last time, you should think that the bracha for those, tomato sauce and things like and ketchup should be hadama, because it's true that they're pureed, but they're meant to be eaten. That's the typical way that you eat them. And the Mishur explained it as within the Ramah that even the Ramah who says we make shahakal on pureed foods like jam, holds that if the food is meant to be eaten like that, that's what the typical way to use it, then we keep the original bracha. So in which case the bracha for, let's say, if I eat some ketchup, should be hadama. Okay, but that's not the practice. In practice, poskim say that no, the bracha is shahakal, and there's different reasons are given for why the bracha stays shahakal. So the Sefer V'Zoysa Bracha says he comes in from an Evan Oizer, but which is sort of comes from a Rajba. Mishmur brings this Evan Oizer, but we'll see later in a bit. Ramosha basically says the same thing also, that this that we say that a pureed food keeps its bracha of eitz or hadama. If that's the typical way you use that food, that's only if you're going to use the food. If the typical way to use it is in its pureed form, like when we had questioned this was like before, like about corn, you crush up the corn and then you eat tortillas. You just eat them. Okay, but if the pureed food will not be eaten as is, it's always going to be tuffled to something else. It will always be eaten as part of another food. Then you can't say that's the real use of how the food was, what was planted for. Okay, and the bracha, then the bracha is shahakal, and the bracha becomes shahakal. So tomato sauce, and the V'Zoysa Bracha wasn't about tomato sauce, but tomato sauce and tomato paste are a perfect example of that, because people don't usually eat them straight. They eat them, it's part of pizza or lasagna or pasta or something like that. You put it with something else. It's the tuffle to something else. So even though the tomatoes were grown through pureeing, that was the whole purpose for these tomatoes to be planted, the bracha on them stays shahakal. Okay? We'll have another reason in the future. This is one reason so far. Another reason in a second to bet tomato paste. But let's pause for a second and see about peanut butter. Okay, so seemingly the same logic should apply to peanut butter also. Peanut butter is not so... people do eat peanut butter straight, but most of the use of peanut butter is on something else. Like you put peanut butter into a pastry, you put peanut butter put onto a slice of bread. So it's secondary, and therefore, even though the peanuts are created to be used in that way, eating the peanut butter straight, you would not make hadam on it because that's not considered you're eating it in the main use, even though they're really meant to be into peanut butter. Now, as we think about this, let's pause again and say, is it even true? The question is making this assumption that peanuts are grown to be made into peanut butter. Is that true, or is peanut butter made for eating? So let me just give you some information about that. Okay, it seems that there are 4 main breeds of peanuts, and they're called Runner, Virginia, Spanish, and Valencia. Okay, in the United States, about 85% of the peanuts are either a Runner and about 10% are Virginia. Okay, so we're going to ignore the Spanish and Valencia. Okay, we're just talk about those two because they're 95% of the peanuts. So it turns out that Runners have a very high oil content, and somehow that makes them good for making peanut butter. And in fact, most Runners, not most, like a huge amount, but what I read, it was 54% are grown to turn into peanut butter. Okay. In contrast, Virginia peanuts are larger and makes them really good for eating them whole. So they call them in the shell. They call them ballpark peanuts. And also, since they're harder, that makes it more suited if you want to make chunky peanut butter. So, and until I was looking into this, in my mind, the way you make chunky peanut butter is you just, same as making regular peanut butter, you just put in some chunks. But it turns out that when you want to make chunky peanut butter, they tend to use the Virginia peanuts because they make better peanut butter than Runner peanuts. Okay. And of course, all the things that I just told you are going to change from time to time and from one country to the next. Of course, everyone's got their own ways of doing these things. So if you think that the bracha might be hadama for peanut butter, somehow you don't agree with me, it may very much depend on these details. Okay. Now, I work with the assumption that if there's different types of peanuts, and there's a farmer look that says Runner peanuts and Virginia peanuts are not the same thing, then we're going to treat them differently. We're going to, which one is the typical use of a peanut is not one for all peanuts. A Runner peanuts might be different than Virginia peanuts. Now, Rabbi First said we might even break it down further to a specific farmer. I mean, if we have a farmer that's contracted that he grows peanuts for Skippy, okay, that's his business. Rabbi First wanted to say is those peanuts were planted for turning into pureeing. Meaning, we shouldn't look at the whole klal of Runner peanuts. We say if your farm that's what you do, planted for that. He thought that should make it planted for pureeing, which would lean us towards making the hadama. Again, we said we don't, but it would lean us towards that. I'm not sure everybody agrees to that. Okay. And one last thing about chunky peanut butter before I move on to this is that chunky peanut butter has chunks of peanuts in it. It has actually pieces of peanuts in it. Now, those pieces are, of course, by themselves would be the bracha of hadama. But in the overall peanut butter, they're tuffle. So if the bracha on peanut butter inherently is shahakal, as we've been talking about, then the presence of those chunks seemingly is not going to make it, they're not going to become the ikr of the peanut butter, and bracha would still say shahakal, even though those chunks per se would be hadama. Okay, now, Shem Zalman Auerbach has another reason why the bracha for peanut butter is shahakal. Till now we said it's because you don't eat it as is; you eat it, as part of another food. He said the only time we say that something with a planted specifically for using ground up or pureed gets the lower bracha, the shahakal, is only when that pureed form will be a better way to eat the food. Then we say that's the main way of using it, and then it keeps the main bracha. But if the crushed form is just as good as the original, it's a different way to eat it. It's not better, it's just different. A different way to use it. You could eat whole peanuts, you could eat peanut butter. Just two different ways of eating peanuts, the same thing. So then the bracha for the pureed version is shahakal, even though you planted them for use like that. And he's understanding that not the inchi adaita. They planted for this purpose means that's the best way to use this food. And he doesn't bring him a card to it, and there are reasons to think some of the people who we're talking about here. There's reason to think that not everybody agrees with this sheet over here. Okay, but this reason that Rosh Hashanah said about peanut butter is possibly would explain be another reason why tomato paste, etc., should be shahako, because people eat tomatoes as is, and they eat tomato paste. They eat both of them. It's not nafka better. So that would possibly be a reason. I'm not sure that's correct, because as I said beforehand, the tomatoes that they use for making tomato paste and tomato sauce are a kind of tomatoes that are not really so good for eating as is. So you could eat them, but they're not so great. Actually, for those tomatoes, making them into ketchup is actually the better use for them. So I'm not sure if this second reason from Zalman will help us for tomatoes, but we had our own reason beforehand about why tomato paste and those kind of things, the bracha on them is shahak. Okay, let's move on to another food. So far we talked about corn, tomatoes, and peanuts, and now let's move to chocolate. A question that, excuse me, many people may be familiar with this, and that is the fruit. It's called the bean, but the fruit of the cocoa tree that bean, in it is something called cocoa powder and cocoa butter, and that's the ingredients that we use to make edible chocolate. Now there is in Shari Tshuva talks about what the bracha is for liquid chocolate, which is the original way that people used to eat chocolate. It was like a hot chocolate beverage. But the things that he talks about have nothing to do with what we want, having to do with edible chocolate, like a chocolate bar. Now, nobody eats cocoa beans as is, okay? And they're obviously grown to turn into chocolate bars and things like that. So everything we heard until now should tell us that should potentially be ha'etz. These plants are, it's true we're eating them in a pureed form, but the pureed form is the plan and the goal, and the way you use this food is to eat it in pureed form. It's not even like tomatoes, that you could eat whole tomatoes and pureed tomatoes. Nobody eats whole chocolate beans or nibs. Nobody eats them as is. You always eat it in the ground up form. So seemingly, the bracha should be ha'etz. So why do we make shahako? In fact, as many people know, Rosh Zalman Taka grapples with this. He says, I don't know what to tell you. He says everything points to being ha'etz. He says, well, maybe you'll tell me what I just told you is the opposite of what I said beforehand. Well, I don't know, he doesn't connect it to that, but opposite of what I just said to you, what I, David Cohen, mentioned a second ago from Rosh Zalman. He says, maybe since nobody would eat whole cocoa beans, that means is that cocoa beans themselves is this weak fruit. It's not your everyday fruit. It's a weak fruit because nobody would eat it. It's just the fruit as is. So automatically, whatever you're going to do with this thing, the bracha is going to be shahako. Okay. And he says maybe that's the reason. He says no, but it doesn't seem right, because there's a Taz. He brings a Taz who talks about the bracha. What happens if you eat? Who says the bracha if you eat ground up cinnamon mixed with sugar? I mentioned this before. The bracha is hadama. He says now, cinnamon is basically the same as cocoa. Nobody eats cinnamon straight. You only eat it mixed with sugar or mixed into some other kinds of foods, and you always eat it ground also. And the Taz says that the bracha is hadama, that even though this food, you never eat this food by itself, no one eats it by itself, the bracha doesn't get automatically downgraded to shahaka, because why should it be? If the normal way to eat it is ground up, then that's the normal way. So as like we're saying, if the normal way to eat it is ground, then the bracha, when it's ground, it keeps us the original bracha, that eitz or hadama. So he says, so sometimes says, so it seems to me like the bracha should be ha'etz. He says, especially if the cocoa is more than half of the chocolate. Not really so clear why we should care whether it's more or less than half. I'm not exactly sure what the reason for that is. In fact, the truth is that usually it's less than half. So Rosh Hashanah says, listen, if it's more than half, then I think the bracha should be 8. I'm going to tell you more in a second about Rosh Hashanah, his conclusion, but he says it should be more. But in practice, I suspect it's usually less than half. And just to understand that, in many countries they have laws. Or regulations, we call them, of how much the minimum amount of cocoa mass have to be in a product for it to be called chocolate. Okay, so if you want to call something bittersweet chocolate, it'll have this much. Need to have a minimum of this much cocoa mass, or milk chocolate and white chocolate. Each one has their own ideas of how much it has to be. Some let you get away with even as little as 10%, and others have as much as 60%. And all kinds of countries have one place all the way in the middle. But so, of course, everybody does what they want to. Like, if the minimum is 10%, doesn't mean they can't put more, but it just gives you a feel for how much chocolate mass, things from the cocoa bean, are actually in there. And in fact, it usually is less than half of it. Okay, but now let's go back for a second over here. So someone said, I'm going to get to his other thing in a second. Okay, but that's going to take me a while to get back to. Okay, I will get in a few minutes get back to Rosh Hashanah. But let me just tell you, in Shevet HaLevi, Rav Wosner has his own reason why the bracha should be shahakol. He says that cocoa inherently has a bitter taste, and people wouldn't want to eat it by itself. And it's only when you add sugar and milk and whatever else you add to it, does get the sweet taste that people want to have it. He says, and the fact that you have to do that in itself downgrades the bracha to shahakol. Okay, so this idea that since you have to add other things, if you puree it and then you have to add other things to the bracha, makes the bracha back to shahakol, comes from the idea basically comes from a Trumas edition, which is the makar for the Ramah's din about cherry jam, and the Trumas edition, when he's talking about it, says that if you change the food, like you puree it together with, you make a big change in the food's taste, like by adding in sugar, then that's an extra reason for the bracha to be shahakol. And basically that's what Rav Wosner is saying. Now, the problem is like this: the Trumas edition is saying this within the sheet of Rashi, which again, the sheet of Rashi about the jam that we talked about at the beginning last time, but he asks a question on that from a different Rashi, Rashi in Yuma, who says, talking about a food called himlosa, where there's this implications that it's even if both of these are true, it's been pureed and it's been you have to add other ingredients to make it have a real taste. Even so, the food keeps its original bracha. Okay, himlosa is an electuary. Okay, which means a medicinal item made of herbs mixed with honey. Anyhow, so the Trumas edition, he asks this question, a stira on himself, Rashi to Rashi, and he says the difference is like this: himlosa is grown specifically to be ground up, and then you're going to add honey to it and make the taste sweeter. And that sort of is brought in Shulchan Aruch. So the point is, he's saying is, Trumas Hadesh is saying is, if that even if we change the form and we have to add things to change the taste, the bracha stays with the high bracha, the Eitzo Hadama. If that's the original intention when you planted this food, you planted with that in mind. And he's talking about himlosa, whatever that is. But we're talking about, for our cocoa, is exactly the same example of that. So it is the Trumas Hadesh said there's such an idea that having those two together might make the bracha get knocked down to shahakol. And that has to do with the bracha for jam. He says, but cocoa is exactly the same as himlosa. Okay, you grow it to be able to make it, and the way you're going to make it edible is by grinding it and by adding the sweeteners and other things to it. So seemingly, the Trumas Hadesh would be say that should not be a reason to change the bracha to shahakol. So Hagan Rav Wosner seems to be based on what the Trumas Hadesh talks about, his idea that he talks about, but in practice, it doesn't seem like the Trumas Hadesh could really be the answer for why chocolate should be shahakol. Now, in Igros Moshe, he doesn't explain. He's just like in passing. He's just assuming that the bracha on chocolate is shahakol. And Rav first said that the reason why Rav Moshe said that the reason why he thinks it's shahakol is because he understood that most chocolate is used for decorating things, like decorating a cake or flavoring a food, like putting chocolate into ice cream, rather than to eat it as is. Rather than eating it as chocolate bars. Now, I don't know factually whether that's true or not, but he's working with that assumption that most chocolate is used for those kind of things. Like you put a chocolate into brownies. And that would be the same as something we spoke about last time from V'zois HaBracha, about tomato sauce and peanut butter, that if the main use is always to be tafel to something else, then even though you have in mind to make it originally like this, that doesn't take away from the bracha. That doesn't keep its original bracha. It gets knocked down to shahakol. Okay, so when I'm going to talk more about, I'm going to the next food now. We're going to hear some ideas about chocolate still there also. But where we're leaving off now is that we've had these possible ideas of why chocolate might be shahakol. Rosh Hashanah at this point, anyhow, is saying, I don't know, sure seems like it should be eights to me. Okay. Now let's go to another set of foods, sugar and soy. Our issue that we've been dealing with again and again is that we have a food that's meant to be used in the ground form and not the itchy then it keeps the bracha even though it's been ground up. We saw also that if it's really dramatically changed from the way it was originally, then the bracha can get knocked down to shahakal. That was one of the reasons. One of the reasons we had to explain the rif. The first reason we had to explain the rif last time of why the bracha of pas dochen is shahakal, and that's also how the Mishnah Berurah explains why the bracha on sugar is shahakal. Sugar comes from a plant that grows in the ground. It should be hadama. Seemingly, it should be hadama. So, but the sugar crystals are so different from the sugar cane or the sugar beets that they come from that therefore the bracha is shahakal, even though they're obviously planted for that purpose. You don't plant sugar cane because it looks pretty. You plant sugar cane because you're going to turn it into sugar that we're going to eat, put into our coffee, and sugar beets also. So even though it's planted for that reason, but since the sugar that we have is so dramatically different from the original sugar cane or the sugar beets, therefore we make shahakal. Now I'll just throw in here, you should just be aware, it's actually a machlokes rishonim what the bracha is for sugar. Machlokes rishonim whether the bracha is shahakal or hadama. The Shulchan Aruch paskins mitam safek that you should make shahakal, safek brachas we should make shahakal on it. So this reason that I'm telling you from the Beracha, from the Mishnah Berurah, is explanation for the tzad that you make shahakal. In practice, we make shahakal because it's a suffix, so we make shahakal misafik. But he's explaining the tzad why it should be shahakal, and that's because it's so different from the original. Now, the contemporary poskim, like for example Rav Vosner in a different place, says that's the reason why the bracha for things made out of soy is shahakal, like tofu or imitation meat or cheese. The bracha for those things is shahakal. When you look at a soy burger, you can't see any way how that thing has anything to do with the original soybean that it comes from. Okay, it's like so dramatically different. It's like you look at this and you look at that, you say there's no way that they're connected to each other. And so the bracha becomes shahakal. Again, like the first reason the Rabbeinu Yoni gave in the Rif, that when it's so dramatically changed, even though it's planted for that reason, even though it was planted for that reason, the bracha is going to be shahakal. So now, soy to us sounds like the more obvious example, more obvious application of this din than the Mishnah Berurah talking about sugar, because I mean, when you think about sugar cane and sugar beets, what's most prominent about them, I know they may have different color and this and that, but the most prominent part of them is they're really sweet. And when you taste sugar, the sweetness obviously carries over. So we were saying no. Even so, the look at the sugar in your hand and look at the sugar beet, and you say they seem very far apart. So then we say that it becomes shahakal. So kosher cane the in soy where it's even more hard to see a connection. Then therefore it's for sure that it should be. This reason should apply. And it happens to be another thing you should just be aware. Other reasons that we've talked about that would apply to soy is that, first of all, is that a lot of the soy is grown for animal feed. So we saw before with some Sefer that we shouldn't look just at the human use of the food, but we should look at the overall use of the food. And the overall use of soy has a lot of animal uses, which is to say a lot of it is used as is. So we are making an assumption that it's mainly used ground, and that may not be true, that it's mainly used ground if we look at the overall use of soy. Another thing is that lots of the soybeans that are used become soybean oil and other crushed items. Become soybean oil, which is always secondary to something else. No one eats soybean oil as is. So again, what we spoke about tomato paste and peanut butter, those reasons, since it's always used as secondary to something else, then even though you planted it for that reason, it might still be shahakal. Okay, now we've talked about soy and sugar. It could be that some of these things some of this logic might apply to chocolate also. Cocoa beans go through a lot of steps to go from being the bean that comes off the ground to becoming chocolate that you can eat a chocolate bar. Like it could be, it would be ground into a liquid and then a paste. Then it could be separated into a powder and the oil and fat, milled into a powder, stirred into a liquid form, what they call kanching. So it could be, now all of those help bring out the flavor of the chocolate. It doesn't change it, the change is still become, but it could be that it might not be so different from sugar, where in sugar, the sugar that you have tastes like the sugar that comes out of the sugar cane. It's similar, but that's only the taste of it, but the form of it seems so different that we say it's not the same. So that's what the Mishnah Berurah said. Beracha said that was an explanation for sugar. So it could be that chocolate maybe has the same kind of a idea, that maybe it's so different from the original bean that would be a reason to be makel. So it so happens that in Shlomo Zalman's tshuva about chocolate, he sounds like he's trying to discount this idea. He says, because towards the end of the tshuva, he says, he's talking about why it should be eight. And he says, Sharei loy nepach l'dover acher. Okay, he says it didn't become something else, which seemingly he's trying to preempt you from thinking that, oh, maybe chocolate is like sugar. It became so different that you shouldn't make eights on it. Okay, that's that's seemingly in his tshuva he's trying to preempt this idea. But you should know, Shlomo Zalman has a tshuva about the bracha for chalva, which is made from crushed sesame seeds, and he says that logically, he says when he's talking about chalva, he says, listen, logically, the bracha on chocolate should be ha'etz, but the minig, the whole world makes the bracha of shahakol. He says, and for sure, for chalva, we should do the same thing, and we should also, the minig should be to make shahak on it, because it's because chalva also has this new form. It became like a new thing, so different from the original seed. So that's like even more so, that much more that it became different, a new thing. Sort of hinting at that maybe the reason why people make shahakal on chocolate is because they're looking at it as being so dramatically different. So I'm mentioning this first as a possible reason why the bracha on chocolate, why people make shahakal on it. But I'm also mentioning it as a sort of an acknowledgement that Shlomo Zalman himself acknowledges that Lamaisa people make shahakal on chocolate. Okay, one more food we need to talk about, and that is orange juice. Okay, at the beginning, when we first started last time, we said the Gemara says that juice squeezed from basically every fruit and vegetable, except for like grapes and olives. Okay, but basically every fruit and vegetable is considered zei b'alma, and it does not have the bracha of the fruit. The bracha is shahakal. Okay, so it's just like consider the sweat of the food. The Chazon Ish says, well, that's only true for a standard juice, where the main way you use the fruit is to eat it as is. Let's say apples. The main thing you do with apples is you eat them as an apple. Juice is the not main use of it, so we say zei b'alma and you make shahakal. But if we have a fruit that is commonly used for making juice out of it, then the juice hold on to the bracha of ha'etz. Hold on to the bracha because that's that's the use for it. So he's saying is that the not the itchi adaita dahachi is stronger. It overrides the idea of zei b'alma. Zei b'alma says this is it's not even the fruit at all. It's nothing. You don't make the ha'etz on it. And he's saying not the itchi adaita dahachi is is stronger than that. And it says if that's what people make it for, then the bracha on it is keeps the original bracha and it's a eight. So the Chazon Ish says that he thinks this is the position of all the Rishonim hold like that. That's what he says, and therefore you make eights on it. The Mishnah Berurah says no, it's actually a machlekes Rishonim, and he says his pasuk is that you should make shahakal on juices like that. And of course, the nafkamina for this, as I've been saying, is orange juice. The Chazon Ish himself says specifically that the bracha on orange juice should be eight, because the oranges are planted specifically for turning into juice, especially the the juice oranges. I mean, maybe oranges as a complete class of food, maybe lots of them are for eating, but juicing oranges are mainly meant for making juice. That's what they're good at. Mishnah Berurah doesn't talk about oranges specifically, but according to him, even though it's not yet done, he says in Lamaisa, the bracha then will be shahakol, and it's treated as zei b'alma. Okay? Now, maybe, let's say, does this help us at all with our chocolate question? Okay? Should we say that now seemingly we should say this is not the case of chocolate, because it's not a zeya, it's not the juice coming out of it, it's the whole bean being crushed up. This is not zeh. Zeh ba'alma is when we take a juice and we squeeze it out, we got the juice out of it. So we could say it's zeh ba'alma. That doesn't seem to be, wouldn't seem to be a help for a reason for chocolate. However, you should know that in Rav Wosner says that there are some Rishonim who hold that for fruits, not for vegetables, but only for fruits, if you liquefy the fruit, it has a different status than a solid fruit. And the bracha on them is shahakal, even if it's not in Jedai Hachi. Okay? That is to say, is he's understanding that for fruits, Zebi Alma just means is the fruit is now in liquid form. Not that we've always been understanding that Zebi Alma means is we've taken just an extract of the fruit. And in which case, that's only have an extract as opposed to grinding up a whole fruit. But he's understanding that it's because because we've liquefied the fruit, and then the bracha becomes shahakal. Okay, he's not talking about chocolate. He's actually talking about orange juice, and he's giving a reason why it should be shahakal. But we're saying maybe that could be an explanation for what would be why chocolate should be shahakal also. Now it's not perfect comparison because even though chocolate is in liquid form as part of the process of becoming a chocolate bar, that's a temporary state. At room temperature, chocolate is a solid. So I'm not sure if he would have agreed. Orange juice, it stays a liquid. Here, it's just temporarily a liquid. I'm not sure he would have agreed to him. But you should just know this idea that the Rav Wosner says to explain for orange juice. He tells you. I know that this what I'm saying to you is based on a Rajba that other Rishonim don't agree with it. Second is I have to say it's only for fruits, not for vegetables. The Raya is that it's not true for vegetables. He says I have to say it's true for fruit, not for vegetables, which he tells you is not the pashas. That there should be a difference between one and the other. And Mishmur specifically disagrees with this whole thing. Anyhow, but it might be it's his explanation for orange juice and might be an explanation possibly for chocolate. Okay, one last thing, nothing to do with specific fruits and vegetables we're talking about, is that of all the things we've been talking about last time and this time. And a lot of them we say the bracha is shahakol. Okay, we decide that the bracha should be shahakol, the not the original ha'etz or hadama. But in truth, all those kind of things that we everything that I could remember that we talked about was always the shahakol is based on a suffix brachas. We're not sure if the bracha is the higher bracha or the lower bracha. Like for example, we really passing like the Rambam that the bracha for a lot of these things keeps the original bracha, but we're being machmir to be choishish for a sheet of Rashi that says in certain cases the bracha is shahaka when it's been pureed. That's an example. But there are all kinds of other cases that we had. A lot of the things ended up being, well, here's a possible reason why it might be shahaka. Sag bracha shahaka, make the shahaka instead of the eitz hadam. So the Ramah says, because of that, since all of these things are based on in a lot of these are based on safek brachas lahakal, he says, what happens if you had made a eitz hadam on another food? Then, or you by mistake made a eitz hadam on this food, not realizing that you should have made a shahakal, then Safek Bracha says, don't make a new bracha. So if you eat a cucumber and you make hadam on that, and now you want to eat tortilla chips, then the bracha, you don't make a shahakal on that. Because the only reason to make the shahakal was because of Safek Brachas. Sorry, in many cases, I don't remember that specific one, we end up being knocked down to the point of it being Safek Brachas lahakal. So, if now I have a safek brachas to make no bracha, then that's what I should do also. And that's something that most people are not familiar with. That the Rama says this. He says my chumras to make shahakal on a lot of these foods is only based on the safek or a chumrah, and therefore safek brachas. The opposite will tell us not to make the bracha if I have that chance.